Every time M2 goes up, traders call it inflationary. That's wrong, and it's already cost them this year. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why M2 is a broken inflation signal, what the corrected indicator looks like, and how it flagged the 2021 CPI breakout 6 to 9 months ahead of time, and what the same indicator is saying right now. If you're still trading the rate cut cycle, you're trading a market that ended 7 months ago. Futures are now pricing at a 1 in 3 chance the next move is a hike, and the signal that called it has been in the data since November. Stefan Miran published a paper in November of 2024 that shook global markets. The Mar-a-Lago Accord paper. He's back. This one is called A Return to Monetarism. Miran's paper isn't about policy. It's about forecasting. He's arguing the Fed should put money supply back into how it builds its inflation models, specifically something called P-star, a price level target derived from money supply using the equation MV equals PY. Kevin Warsh was sworn in as chair of the Federal Reserve in May and set up a committee to examine how the Fed forecasts inflation. This paper is aimed at that committee. Miran's adapted P-star model puts current prices roughly where money supply says they should be. The call isn't to tighten. The call is neutral. Hold and wait. That's the opposite of what most traders took from it. Miran isn't calling for a hike. He's calling for patience. But there's a deeper problem underneath that conclusion. M2 itself is broken as an inflation signal. If the Warsh committee builds P-star on top of it without fixing this, they'll be staring at the same incomplete picture the Fed stared at in 2020. Here's the flaw. Pull up M2 year over year against CPI. More money, more inflation. That's the theory. They don't consistently track, and the why tells you everything. Take 2008. M2 growth accelerated from about 6% to nearly 10%. Was that inflationary? CPI went from plus 5.3% to roughly minus 2%. Money supply surged and we got deflation. Same shape in 2020. M2 exploded. CPI stayed flat to falling all year, and the inflation didn't show up until 2021. So if M2 is your inflation signal, you are firing at the wrong time and pointing in the wrong direction. Here's the reason. Most people skip this part. The single biggest component of M2 is savings deposits, what the Fed now calls other liquid deposits. $10.4 trillion against about $7 trillion in demand deposits. And savings deposits are risk-off money. When markets sell off, people pull cash out of equities and park it in savings. M2 goes up. But that isn't spending. That's fear. Rising savings deposits don't cause inflation. They signal the opposite. M2 goes up when confidence collapses. So a P-star model built on it, including Miran's version, can't tell inflationary spending apart from defensive hoarding. That's why the Fed looked at M2 in 2020 and saw nothing to worry about. The composition hit it. So what do you strip out? What do you add? There's a corrected model. It fired in July of 2020, months before CPI broke out, and it fired again a lot more recently than that. Simon White, a Bloomberg macro strategist, built what he calls behavioral monetarism. The approach is simple. Strip out savings deposits, add money market fund assets, then invert the result. Savings deposits come out because they're counter-cyclical. They rise when risk appetite falls, and they have no reliable link to consumer spending. Money market funds go in because that's where genuinely spendable cash sits. It moves with real activity, not with fear. Now watch what this does in 2020. Savings deposit growth peaked in July of 2020 and started decelerating. That's the inflection. The flood of money into defensive savings slowing down as people shifted back towards spendable forms. The corrected indicator turned, signaling inflationary pressure was building 6 to 9 months before CPI broke out in 2021. The Fed didn't start hiking until March of 2022, 20 months between a clear signal and a response. Plain M2 was still climbing the whole time, from the fear response from the COVID crash. and the Fed saw nothing urgent in it. Strip savings deposits, add money market funds, invert. A 6 to 9 month lead on inflation, sitting in public data, and the Fed missed it. Now here's the part that should get your attention. That indicator did the exact same thing again. And this time, we already know how the story ends. Here's where the live signal sits today. The corrected indicator went negative in November, and the market has spent the last month catching up to it. Savings deposit growth isn't just falling, it's contracting, and it's been negative for 7 straight months. The same pattern that fired in July of 2020, the one that preceded the 2021 CPI breakout, ran again. And this time we already know how it ends. CPI went from 2.4% in January to 4.2% in May. June cooled off to about 3.5%, but that's still a full point above where the year started. The reacceleration White's model projected has already arrived. So the trade everyone was in is gone. The Fed cut 3 times last year and hasn't moved since. The odds of a hike at this week's meeting went from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 in a single week. White's conclusion was never wait and see, like Miran's. He said policy should be tightened, and the market is now arguing his side. Here's the scenario that should concern you. If the Warsh Committee adopts P-star and looks at plain M2, they'll conclude policy is roughly neutral, exactly what the incomplete model suggests. The savings deposit signal will be right there in the data, and they'll ignore it. Again, you now know that the standard M2 is structurally broken, and that the corrected indicator has been negative since November, while the market has spent the last month repricing from rate cuts toward potential hikes. But knowing that a signal fired isn't the same as knowing what price is doing with it, or when this becomes a trade you can actually act on. Here's what understanding that corrected analysis doesn't give you: the truth about the direction of price. It gives you conviction, and conviction matters, but price is what tells you whether your conviction is true or not. The measured move is a framework for understanding the direction of price. If you trade on conviction without that framework, you could be on the wrong side of a trade for days, weeks, or even months before price tells you what you could have known earlier. That framework is what I teach. The traders in my community don't trade their conviction. They know what price has to do to confirm the story, and where the trend fails if it doesn't. They use price to understand the direction to trade in. And when conviction and price disagree, they trade in the direction of price. That's a repeatable process. That's the process I teach every day at eminiaddict.com.